I want to turn now to the Northern Renaissance. The ideas of the Italian Renaissance spread northward to England, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Most of you are going to be familiar with the English Renaissance because this is where we get Shakespeare coming onto the scene, and most all of you guys read a Shakespeare play in high school. So rather than spending a bunch of time on Shakespeare, what I want to do is to talk to you about a specific way the Renaissance influenced Germany and, by extension, Christianity itself. What I want to look at is the Protestant Reformation. This was one of the most dramatic cultural changes that took place in Europe as Renaissance ideals spread. The leader of the Protestant Reformation was a man by the name of Martin Luther. You will get plenty of opportunities in the next links to learn and discover more and more about Martin Luther and this Reformation. Luther taught philosophy and biblical studies at Wittenberg University in Germany. He often used a debate format for his lectures, a very classical teaching style. Luther also loved the arts and hymns, and one of his most famous hymns, if you guys are churchgoers, is "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." You may have sung that song before, heard it. If not, I encourage you to Google it and look at the words, because the words of "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" really gets at a lot of Luther's ideas and a lot of the ways that he changed the Christian church. While he was a professor at Wittenberg, he produced a translation of the Bible. This undertaking made him rethink the notion of salvation, and he came to believe that salvation was not by works, but by God's grace alone. And this very simple revelation of Luther's led to the Reformation. In 1517, Luther made a bold move, and he tacked 95 theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg University. This action of tacking these theses on the door of the church indicated that he was ready to debate. He was ready to talk about what he believed was a revelation. In those theses, one of the things that he attacked was the Roman Catholic doctrine of indulgences. This was the belief that sins could be forgiven through payment. Now, there are 95 of these different issues he has with the Catholic Church, and I've posted them in a link as well, so you can go in and you can look at each one of these theses. But this was one of the main things, this idea of indulgences, that really got Luther worked up and he saw to be very detrimental to Christianity. This is a statement by Luther that shows you how serious he was about his beliefs. He believed in salvation by grace and not works. And he believed that because the Catholic Church was operating under a doctrine of works, that if you look at the last sentence here, that the papacy is a veritable torture chamber of consciousness and the very kingdom of the devil. Now, these were fighting words. These were enough to get him at first noticed by the Catholic Church and then later on excommunicated by the Catholic Church. As I said, he believed in salvation by grace and not works. And he cited an example of a Dominican monk named Tetzel, who was, for lack of a better way to put it, a traveling indulgence salesman. So Tetzel would go from town to town and village to village and take money and then give people forgiveness for their sins. So that was the process that Luther totally despised. Tetzel was banned from Wittenberg, where Luther lived, but people would go out into the countryside to meet him and buy their pardons. Then they would claim that they didn't need to go to Mass or confession because they had already purchased a lifetime of pardons. And the next slide I'm going to show you is one of Tetzel's famous sayings. Or I thought I was, I'm sorry. But Tetzel used to go around claiming, as soon as the coin into the box rings, a soul from purgatory to heaven springs. So he was quite an interesting guy. The basic tenets of Luther's teachings, this slide is really going to basically take the 95 Theses and pare them down. The first, he wanted to strip the Roman Catholic Church of its ritual, its hierarchy, and its worship of saints. He wanted the church to be about the people, not about the priests. And he wanted to remove this sense of hierarchy and ritual from it to bring religion back more directly into the hands of the people. In conjunction with that, he wanted to encourage people, Christians, to go back to the Bible to find truth for themselves, not to rely on a priest to tell them what the Bible said, but to read it for themselves. And then he wanted the priest to search for truth in the Bible, not the doctrines necessarily of the church. He wanted to reduce the number of sacraments to 2. Those 2 being baptism and Holy Communion, or the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, or however you refer to it. He advocated a personal study and understanding of the Bible, what he termed the universal priesthood of believers. He believed that people could indeed tease out the truth from the Bible for themselves, that they could pray directly to God. And he wanted to encourage people doing that. And Luther also had a very strong belief in human rights and of the idea of community and people helping each other. This is a famous quotation by Martin Luther. Here he says, "Christ and all saints are one spiritual body, just as the inhabitants of a city are one community and a body, each citizen being a member of the other and of the entire city." These ideas of Luther laid grounds for social democracy and equality. So he really got people thinking beyond religion to more social and political ideas, that each person is a member of a society and a member of community, and each person has a responsibility toward the other members of the society or the community in which he or she lives. There were others who followed Luther. John Calvin was one of the famous other followers of Luther. He was French, but they rejected his ideas in France, so he moved to Geneva. John Calvin was much more radical than Luther. He wanted to strip away the trappings of the church, as Luther did, but he also wanted to do a couple of other things. He wanted to limit the music in the church to the Psalms only. He was against feasting, dancing, wearing makeup, jewelry, lace. He was against swearing, gambling, adultery, or fornication. And he removed all stained glass and statues from St. Peter's in Geneva, just to sort of strip everything down. And he thought all these things detracted and distracted people from their religion. Like Luther, though, Calvin believed the Bible was the supreme source of knowledge. Like Luther, he believed in original sin. He didn't believe that all people were born good. He believed that all people were born sinful, and that it was only through God's grace that people could overcome their sin. He believed God's will was absolute, final, the end of it. He believed that faith was greater than works, and salvation by grace alone. Calvinism spread into France, the Netherlands, England, Scotland, North America, and became the basis for Puritanism in the New World in America. The Reformation divided Europe spiritually. Spain, Portugal, Italy, most of France, southern Germany, Austria, parts of Eastern Europe, and Ireland remained Catholic. But Switzerland, Scotland, England, northern and eastern Germany, and Scandinavia became Protestants. There's a lot of debate about what caused the Reformation. Luther obviously played a huge role. Someone had to catalyze the movement. There was also an increased nationalism moving throughout Europe, and they resented a little bit the homage they had to pay to the Roman Catholic Church, to the Pope in Rome. Many of these countries had been subjects under the Roman Empire, and now that had been centuries from existence, this sense of nationalism was emerging. There was increased frustration, like I said, with having to pay homage to the papacy. Reformist thoughts had been in the air. People had been thinking some of the same things Luther had been thinking for quite a while, but they had never articulated it as Luther had. People were concerned about the moral and intellectual condition of the Catholic clergy. They didn't always act as they were supposed to, and often many of them were totally lacked in education. And finally, many people believe that the Reformation was caused by the idea of humanism and its focus on the individual and the individual ability to strive and to seek and to find. And that this humanism encouraged Luther and encouraged people that they could have a personal relationship with God, that they could read the Bible for themselves. Now, I want to just mention a couple of things to you, because we've talked on and off about how during the Renaissance people were trying to in some way figure out how to mesh together the ideas of humanism and their Christian beliefs. And so I want to show you real quickly some of the ways that humanism and the Reformation were similar. They were both critical of monasticism, the devotion to the saints, and the decrease in the moral and intellectual condition of the Roman Catholic Church. They also both encouraged personal inquiry. You can find it out for yourself. However, there were some differences. Human perfection versus innate depravity. The humanists believed people were born perfect and that the society corrupted them, and so therefore society needed to be tweaked and changed. The reformers believed that people were born in sin and that it was only through their acceptance of Christ and their salvation that society would change. The humanists believed in a universal religion, that there were many different ways that you could come to salvation, whereas the reformers believed in scriptura sola, or scripture alone. Only through Christ could you come to salvation. Despite the differences, though, the Reformation helped lead the changing environment of the Renaissance. And it also laid the foundation of modern Western cultural values, with the emphasis on people's individual judgment, conscience, and faith. And I think you'll recognize these as values that have been hallmarks of our culture for a very long time. An emphasis on individuals and their intellect and their rights. This idea of the Protestant or the Puritan work ethic that is the underlying support of capitalism. The idea that you get up every day and that you work hard and that you're working not necessarily for man, but that you're working for God, and that everything you do should be to His honor and His glory. It encouraged an increase in literacy. So these are, and finally also the use of vernacular, the common language of the people, in scholarship and church services. So these are some of the bits of the legacy left by the Reformation. Whether you associate yourself with Christianity or a Protestant denomination, these are cultural gifts left to the Western world and to Western civilization by the Reformation and by Luther initially. So I hope that you'll enjoy the next few links of learning more about Luther and learning more about the Protestant Reformation.